Going. Oh, we're live. Nice. Team early. I'm gonna go AF podcast because there's been some parents having their kids listen because everyone's home right now. So team early and fun. We're gonna we're gonna go that route. I already had someone from the gym reach out. So here we are. What is this? Day 4 of quarantine? Day 6, 5? Anyways,
But depends where you hit the start
dude,
button.
right? That's true. That's a good point. We're gonna have the at home. I don't even know what's going on with that. The announcement for Wednesday starting at 8 a.m. Safer at home initiative or whatever that looks like. But uh, we're here in the home studio. I've got my friend Ben Greuel uh, zooming in to join us. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill. Glad to be on. Thanks for having me on the podcast. It's a true honor. My name is Ben Greuel. I grew up just down the road from Bill on Casimir Road. Parents still live there. Brother as well. Brother's like, geez, you could probably throw a football to my brother right now.
And wake him up.
But
He's probably just. Were you listening on the feed yesterday? He's like, I woke up this morning, and I had all these feelings, and then he pauses and he's like, it wasn't really morning. I woke up at like 11:40.
Yeah,
I,
it's the alarm clock hasn't gone off over there at the Schmeekley household yet, at least in that wing. Um, uh, yeah, grew up just down the road, and I've spent really graduated from the University of Wisconsin lacrosse. Spent my life kind of hunting, fishing. Grew up doing everything kind of right behind where you're sitting right now, over in the Wisconsin backwaters, turkey hunting, deer hunting, fishing, constantly, especially in middle school, high school, exploring, and then did a lot in northern Wisconsin, and have spent kind of that was and I think we're going to talk about this more down the line, but that was kind of a lot of those early experiences were kind of the catapult that got me into a lot of the topics I'm sure we'll be discussing today, just around conservation and environmentalism and kind of that intersection with hunting and fishing and the traditional hunt and chase of game.
definitely.
Uh,
So with that, I want to kind of dive into so you're talking about growing up hunting, fishing, outdoors, and then before we launch into kind of what you're doing currently and what got you there professionally, and then along with backcountry hunters and anglers, is there a moment you can think of where like the idea of the land ethic took hold, or was something other than something we talk about in the outdoor space?
I think for me it wasn't. I had definitely like a moment that like was the what is the best word I'm looking for here? Was kind of the catapult into my professional career and doing conservation professionally, environmental work professionally. There was definitely a turning point that I had there where I turned it into a career. But kind of that understanding of kind of the interconnectedness, which is the really the foundation of the land ethic and Aldo Leopold, and the amazing words that he wrote down in the San Claudio Almanac, and that a lot of people have replicated. I mean, I think it was really like it was slow over time. I mean, I grew up, I was lucky to grow up in a great part of Wisconsin where I had tons of neighbors my age, a lot of which are still hanging around. We kind of treated the whole neighborhood I use loosely because it's rural still, luckily. And it's kind of like it was like our big backyard. And generally this is still the 80s, early 90s, where you didn't as much have like the stranger danger element. And so it was like, hey mom, I'm going down to the Jensens or Kirsch's or Schmeekleys or whatever, and we'll be back before dinner. That was kind of thing. No cell phones. And so just spent a ton of time outside, started hunting and fishing. I started hunting right when I was 12. My dad was always a big environmentalist and had done a lot, professionally within that sphere. So I think it was just kind of a slow progression. It wasn't ever like a big, kind of, I never had that moment philosophically where there was like this boom kind of moment. It was just this, kind of, it's kind of like, I think it was a little just, that's what we did. And that's what we learned about. Um, and you spend a lot of, there's a lot you can get from spending time outside. I think that isn't in books that like really makes you think. And, I think that was like that ongoing progression.
Yeah, definitely. And what was you talked about the event that catapulted you into pursuing conservation as a career.
Yeah.
What did that look like?
We could probably do a whole podcast on this one itself, but essentially, so I, went to college, went to lacrosse, and the only reason I went there is because I was really into the Bluffs. I went there in like seventh grade for like brains and bronze, like basketball tournament or something like that. Loved it. Loved the Mississippi River. Loved the Bluffs. It was like the closest to mountains that I had seen in Wisconsin. And so, when I got inevitably denied from Madison when I was applying for colleges, I was like, lacrosse, Point, Eau Claire. Didn't want to go to Point. Had a bunch of friends going to Eau Claire. Wanted to start my own. Loved the Bluffs. Went to lacrosse. Um, had like my first serious girlfriend. We dated, got engaged, had a horrible breakup actually in DuBois, Wyoming, which is a whole other part of the whole thing. And I came and I was on a track to be an educator. I was actually going to be I was wanting to be a middle or a high school history teacher, and still have a passion and a compassion for teachers, especially this day and age. Um, but the whole kind of situation personally, I came back to lacrosse and kind of dumped my major, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do, and I applied for an internship with the Wyoming Wilderness Association in Sheridan, Wyoming, for that following summer, and I'd taken some political classes. I think I declared like a political science major or something like that. But I ended up getting an internship in Wyoming for the Wyoming Wilderness Association, um, and did a summer out there working on public lands. Had always been really interested in the American West and the concept of public lands. My family had, we'd gone out to Wyoming, Montana every summer for years to escape the Midwestern heat and to get up into the mountains and backpack, fish, etc. So I did that for a summer, loved it, and then from there, really spent the rest of my college getting involved with and spending a lot of time doing kind of environmental work, but really kind of deep diving into like public lands issues and politics. And so that was kind of it. And then from there, got involved with a whole different social crew, got involved in student government, had a great teacher that just totally fanned the flames in regards to what I was interested in, a lot of independent studies because they didn't really have classes around public lands management lacrosse. Um, but and then had a couple other great professors that provided me opportunities. So yeah.
I like it, man. Uh, I've had a buddy of mine, Chris, on. He's a biologist out in Wyoming, and we've made some recent trips out there to like the Casper Mountain area. And similar story, like my parents used to take us out South Dakota every year for a trip, just checking out different areas each year. I love that. I love that area, so I can see how it would draw you in and kind of fan the flame like you were talking about. So
Counting Waldorf signs and I-90.
there you go. Yeah. So we're we've got you. You're pursuing this thing at school, and actually, how you and I met was through a land and water conservation sign I had up in
Yeah.
my I had up in my yard, from involvement in backcountry hunters and anglers, and I went to a, I don't know, round table in Wausau that Tammy Baldwin was at, and talking about it from the standpoint of someone like myself because it was like all of these conservation organizations, sportsmen's groups, and then I was there representing as part of BHA, but also representing what I do in health and fitness. I'm like,
Cool.
as someone who's always stressing the importance of getting outside, having these public parks, these public areas, these wild spaces available to us is a big part of that. Like if the only thing I had to send someone to was like a park in the middle of town, yeah, it's better than nothing, but it's still not like the spaces you and I are talking about where you can go out and there's no concrete, there's no asphalt, there's no for the most part signs of modern domestic living. So it's super important for myself to safeguard those, especially for my profession. So with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, do you want to talk a little bit about that and things
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
worked on?
yeah. Totally relevant topic too, actually, right now, as there's, well, before the kind of impacts on Congress from the virus, and we're now on what, stimulus three here. There was a big effort to actually, in a lot of political wins, to actually pass a permanent authorization and appropriation for the Land and Water Conservation Fund that incorporated parks funding as well. But yeah, going back, I mean, so I eventually ended up as the Washington State Director for the Wilderness Society, which was a job that was management and all sorts. It was kind of jack of all trades, kind of master of none kind of job. And as part of it, one of the great things was he followed all public lands issues across the country, and Land and Water Conservation Fund being one that was consistently something that I was working on in Washington State, really for the decade plus that I was there, as part of two or three organizations and as a volunteer with a couple others. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is great. I mean, it's one of these things that we always bag on government for these programs that are wasteful or don't have any impact on our day-to-day lives. And the Land and Water Conservation Fund is one of these great programs that really, not only does it have bipartisan support, because the idea is you take revenue from offshore oil and gas royalties. So when the government leases offshore oil and gas royalties in the Gulf or on the East Coast, you take those revenue and you put them into a fund that then the government utilizes through grants to local municipalities and states and counties, um, to actually build and foster green spaces. So everything from public parks, like there are, when I was living in Seattle, there was a Land and Water Conservation Fund plaque at an urban park called Gasworks, which is an old refinery in Lake Union that they turned into this amazing park. And part of the reason it was created was through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but yet it also helps enhance sportsmen's access for like you were talking about, the big wild areas, those areas where that you see a limited footprint of modern society. And so sportsmen in particular, really from the incarnation of the Land and Water Conservation Fund in the 60s until today, have been huge advocates, largely because it helps not only with habitat, you know fragmentation issues, kind of putting big landscapes together, but really access as well. It's a huge tool for hunter angler access across the country. Backcountry hunters and anglers, it's been a huge priority for really since they were created, whatever, a decade and a half ago. It's one of these programs that it's like the no-brainer, and the fact that it's still not something that's fully authorized and funded by the government is just, it's really like, it's a perfect example of some of the ideological problems that we have right now, because there's no more common bond and a program that has bipartisan support. So yeah, I mean, I moved back to Wisconsin like a year and change ago. I'm driving around the circle right by my parents' house. I see the Save LWF sign by house I was familiar with. I think the last time I was at that house was when Danny's aunt lived there, probably, like, I don't know, a long time ago. I was like, how in the heck did that get there? I asked my brother, I was like, who lives in that house? It's like LWF sign, like, it blew my mind. So thank you for that.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm a huge fan, and I've talked to you previously about this, but like I'm embarrassed by how naive and ignorant I was of so many of these things that I appreciate and I value, but I was just so ignorant of how we go about supporting them in perpetuity, or sponsoring them or fighting for them in some regards, because we do have to fight for them, because like you said, for whatever reason, we, even though this is something that should have bipartisan support, should just be universally supported. It's not. We have to get on get on the old email, get on the phone, and constantly be chirping in and be like, "Hey, we haven't fallen asleep. We haven't forgotten about these things. We there's still value in them." And I was talking on an episode yesterday with my friend Derek Bell when we're talking about the idea of health and wellness. Those have become they've become like shanghaied by all of these organizations, and they talk about the idea of ROI. Like, if you can't, oh, what's the return on investment for these things? And it's like, holy shit, really, this is the conversation we're having? That people shouldn't just be well, live well, be able to enjoy certain things that we've, I don't know, enjoyed since we've evolved to where we are today. We have to now, because of the system we're in, support their existence on a spreadsheet. And it's fucking insane, but that's the system we're in, right? We've somehow voted, supported this system somewhere along the way. So now we're kind of, I think we're realizing how fucked up it is and fighting our way. Oh, I swore. I apologize. Wasn't gonna swear in
Okay.
this episode.
It's in the podcast name.
Right?
It's
But
legal.
um, the we now have to like fight our way out of this hole. And what you're talking about, is yeah. How do we I don't know how what we just, I guess, keep reaching out to our representatives, spreading the word. For me in Point, the big thing talking about it is, like, I come from the hunting, fishing, trapping, like that's where I guess my history, my story comes from. But I'm always trying to remind people and relate, like, no, Schmeekley Park, funded by Land and Water Conservation. It's on the sign. Just
Yeah.
nobody sees it, or they're not aware of exactly what that little emblem means. So making those posts, I know this year I sold a few duck stamps because I made a post about something, and people reading my post from the fitness world who just appreciate seeing ducks down at Piffner
Hmm.
Park were like,
Yeah.
holy hell, I'm gonna go buy a duck stamp, even though I have no interest in duck hunting. They see the value in where that money goes to. So I,
Yeah. Yeah, that's I mean, to get up on my, maybe not soapbox after maple syruping here for the last couple of weeks, it's more like my 5 gallon white bucket. But what you were saying just around advocacy, and I've spent my professional life as an advocate engaging other people to take action towards things that they care about. So it's part inspiration and it's part giving them the tools. Um, and come from like a organizing background, and once an organizer, always an organizer, to the point where sometimes I like find myself organizing my friends and I'm like, ugh, should I be doing this? And I'm like, who cares? Fuck it. But I definitely have these moments where I'm like, oh man, here I go again. But the part of like being an advocate for so many years, I mean, I got to know a lot of members of staff, senators, congressmen, and I'd be able to have these candid conversations with them. How much does it mean when someone puts in a phone call? How much does it mean when you get an email? And like, because people are always like, doesn't matter, is this having impact? And the answer is it does. Some forms are better than others. I mean, I always say, number one thing you can do if you want to have impact in an office is sit down and pen a handwritten letter, put a stamp on it, send it, not a duck stamp, this is a regular US mail stamp, put it on the envelope, send it in the mail, advocating for what you want. Somebody will get that and they will say to themselves, holy shit, someone took the time to like send a letter in the mail that was handwritten. They must really care about that, so therefore X many other people probably do in our district or state or whatever. um but it's letters to the editors, op-eds. These offices read this stuff, decision makers read these things both at the state, local, city level, county. And your voice does matter. It's not lost. As much as I think sometimes maybe the media or some maybe our just cynicism and overall our political system will make you think that way. It's definitely worth your time to whatever the thing you care about is, to make that your voice heard to those people. It's not lost. There,
I love
off
it.
my 5 gallon bucket.
I love it. We gotta pour it. We gotta pour that it back into the holding tank now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
no, I'm thinking right now. I'm like, where's my book of stamps? I gotta
yeah.
find those. I'm gonna get on to that. That's this this Thursday. That's the plan, is to make phone calls and emails. But now I'm gonna add a handwritten note to the list of responsibilities for reaching out for some policies that I want to support. So thank you for that. All right,
No
so
problem.
we've got Land and Water Conservation Fund. Let's dive into what would be the next one. The Arctic Refuge. I want to get
Oh
is
yeah.
this a good spot to enter
Oh
into
yeah.
that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So man, my so I kind of talked about college earlier, and I had this great professor who's actually now at Winona State in Winona, Minnesota, Dr. Carol Lindeman. And my last year of college, my 5th year, I decided to take a 5th year just to like screw around. And I think, well, I was still involved in student government, so it was like a really kind of choose your own adventure year for me, but um, on many fronts. But I ended up doing my policy paper, like the big pinnacle project for in this policy class on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and this was during the Bush administration, when there was a big attempt to actually um, open the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas development. And for folks who don't know where the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is roughly 19.3 million acre U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife refuge in the far northeastern corner of Alaska. If you look at a map, it's our largest wildlife refuge by a lot. It's just an incredible place that was set aside in the 1960s originally as Arctic Range, and then in 1980 became the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and was largely protected, more or less, except for one little 1.6 million acre sliver. This is like a Alaska scale, right? On the coastal plain, which is ironically kind of the as they would say, just the kind of the ecological heartbeat of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, in large part because it's where the porcupine caribou herd, which is one of the 4 caribou herds in Alaska. I mean, this is a crazy thing that people forget. Like, the United States has caribou herds that have hundreds of thousands of animals, which
Yeah,
is just mind blowing to me still to this day.
I I it I don't know what we need to do to get more non-hunters involved in speaking up for the not predator species, because like the wolf, he's killing the PR game. Like the wolf's got all these people supporting him, but what was the lower 48 state where they just, it was like the last couple, like 2016, the last caribou.
Woodland Carol's Washington
Yeah,
State.
Washington
Yeah,
State. So there,
yeah.
that herd's gone, and
Selkirk's. Yeah,
no one other than a few people in the hunting space who are like, "Hey, the caribou." Everybody else is like, "The wolves, right? They're still good." Okay, cool. Or in Wisconsin, the conversation I always talk to people about is like the prairie chicken. Like
yeah,
we lost sharp-tailed grouse. We had like all of these people. They want to go west, right? Like elk is a prime example. Everybody's like western hunting, western hunting. I'm getting ready to go
yeah.
western hunting. It's like romanticized. It's like we had all of that here. We messed it up so bad. Now, like what does it look like if we take some of that energy, some of those resources, and invest it here? But no one's really had an answer for me, so I'm just gonna keep asking people. But
Yeah, well, we're starting small with the elk. Every year I'm sure like you, put my name in the hat and cross my fingers and hope to get pulled the rare Wisconsin elk permit. But yeah, we also had bison in Wisconsin, huge herds of bison, especially in the southern half of the state. You know, 200 years ago, actually not that long ago, really, when you think about it. 250 years ago. Yeah, I mean, it's a you know the it's the care. I mean, I mean, well, for one, I mean, sportsmen for a long time have been a huge drumbeat in support of the Arctic Refuge. I mean, it's been largely because of not only do you have sports hunting for and subsistence hunting, of course, on the indigenous peoples for on the porcupine caribou herd, which is the largest of the caribou herds that calve and spend a great deal of time in the Arctic Refuge, and in Canada. They kind of make a big circle that brings them east into Canada, and they come back into Alaska, and then they calve up in the coastal plain. But there's also Dall sheep and moose, and I mean, you have salmon. I mean, the refuge is just incredible. Wolverines. I mean, speaking of species that don't have advocates, musk oxen, which yes, they actually exist. There's again, it's like another one. There's musk oxen in the United States,
Uh huh.
and there most of them are in the coastal plain, and there are some farther to the west as well, um, which are just like prehistoric species.
Yeah, they're
Crazy.
wild animals to see. Yeah, and I've got the Gowichin. How do you?
Gwich'in.
Yeah, tribe people.
Yeah, yeah. So I had this crazy, like I said, I've kind of had this crazy relationship with Arctic Refuge for like 15 years now. Where in college I worked on this paper and volunteered for the Alaska Coalition. And then when I was in college, my last year, my fifth year, I ended up going to Washington D.C. To advocate on behalf of all things Utah wilderness. And there was this America's Red Rock Wilderness Act when there was this, well, there still is this big push to protect a lot of Utah from oil and gas development. This is like a raging fight that's been going on for decades. So I went there as a citizen advocate, lobby my congressmen and senators. And while I was there, I ended up meeting an individual, after breaking both of my thumbs when I promptly arrived in DC. Whole other story. Um, and he was like, "Oh yeah, this, guy that somehow managed to break both of his thumbs in an elevator, perfect fit for a organizer job in the Midwest." So I ended up right out of college getting a job for the Alaska Coalition as a grassroots organizer, working in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, convincing people to convince their members of Congress and senators to work to defend the Arctic Refuge. And did that for a couple of years, living in Ann Arbor. Um, and from that, got offered a job in Seattle, worked for the Sierra Club, doing wildlands, kind of public lands advocacy work. And so that's what took me west, to the Pacific Northwest. Um, and I always kind of worked on the Arctic Refuge off and on after that. And then I got offered a job to work for a foundation to work on the Western Arctic, and this huge management plan during the Obama administration, um, that we finalized. That's now being gutted. And then started working for the Wilderness Society in Washington State. And then after the Tax Act passed in 2017, that was a bill that took the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge coastal plain and transitioned to it from largely being protected from oil and gas development, and it opened it up for oil and gas development. It was a rider on the 2017 Tax Act that we fought. And after that happened, the Wilderness Society was like, Ben, great job. We appreciate what you've done in Washington, but we actually, want you to be spending time working on the Arctic Refuge again. So I took over the leadership of the Wilderness Society's Arctic Refuge team, and have been doing that. That allowed me to move back to Wisconsin, because you can do it anywhere you have, phone and email or internet connection. The team is all over the country. Um, and I've been doing that for the last, over a year and a half now, as we work to defend the refuge from the mandate that was in the 2017 Tax Act legislation. So,
Damn, man. For everyone listening that might not know, the the mining, the oil, anything that's going on up there, what would that all, what would that damage? What's other than like the things you hear traditionally for those things? What specifically are we trying to save up there?
yeah, I mean, it's where do you start with this one? I mean, the you mentioned the Gwich'in people earlier. So, Alaska is a state that's rich with indigenous peoples, many of which still have or almost all of which still have a very large spiritual, but also subsistence connection to the land and to the animals. the Gwich'in people call the coastal plain, I won't say the Gwich'in term, but it's essentially the place where life begins, sacred place where life begins. And the reason that is because of that's where the porcupine caribou herd, like I said, birth and calve their young, and where they spend a lot of the summers on the coastal plain for a lot of reasons. And so to the Gwich'in people, this is a sacred place. The Gwich'in, their their oral tradition is that they came from the caribou, and they and the caribou are one together, and they take care of each other. It's really a beautiful kind of symbiotic kind of connection. And so a lot of what we do in a lot of our efforts towards protection of the refuge stems around protecting the interest of indigenous peoples. It's far more complicated than that, because there are Inupiat people who are on the North Slope, the far northern part of Alaska, who are more divided. There's some interests there that want to see oil and gas development. There's others that would like to see it protected. So really, what's at stake is, one of the most wild places in the entirety of North America in regards to wildness and wilderness values. Ecologically, the coastal plain is just off the charts in regards to being able to support 130,000 herd of caribou, musk oxen, wolves, Dall sheep. Has some of the best breeding and molting grounds for birds in all of North America. There's just dozens of species that summer in the Arctic refuge on the coastal plain and then fly south in their migration. It's from a recreational standpoint, few people go there, but when you do, and I've had the pleasure to be up there a couple times, once on a rafting trip and once literally walking across the coastal plain. Actually, my dad, about 10 years ago, actually, a little over 10 years ago. The recreation opportunities are just immense as well. I mean, it's like truly big W wild. And so all of that would be threatened by oil and gas development. And, the track record of the oil and gas industry on the North Slope of Alaska is sketchy at best. There's a lot of peer-reviewed scientific literature around the effects of oil and gas development, especially in caribou, around avoidance and impacts on birthing and stress. And what you see with this fragile environment, I mean, this is largely tundra coastal plain that's already being impacted by climate change. We're already seeing villages have to be moved on the north coast of Alaska due to climate, based on and you're essentially taking one of those vulnerable areas from climate change, and we see all the photos of polar bears and whatnot, which are very prevalent up in the coastal plain as well. And we're taking one of these most vulnerable areas and we're extracting the oil so that we can only exacerbate climate change. It's just one of the most backwards thinking things in the world. And so like I said, it's one of those things where you ask this question, it's like, well, what's at stake? And it's like, you just sit there and you can go down the checklist. It's like, right now, oil is at $30 a barrel. And this administration is currently pursuing oil and gas development in literally one of the most pristine, untouched, most ecologically important areas, not only in North America, but really the world. And so it's just backwards on so many levels.
Couldn't agree more, man. I like looking at this list, and I'll make sure I put it in the show notes. But and then I've never been there. It's definitely on the bucket list. But the idea, and this goes back to like our conversation on ROI, right? I remember listening to a few other podcasts with state officials and them talking about, the idea that it all should be available for development because over time it will recover, right? That's the thing they want to talk about, is it's renewable resource, or we need to extract it now so it has ROI. It'll still be there for public interest later, but that's, like you said, that's such backwards thinking. It's such a blatant lie, and them not admitting just how damaging modern oil and gas development is. Like, I look at it just from the standpoint of a parking lot. Like, you go to a parking lot that was put in somewhere or some of these areas I hunt, a foundation was built. Someone's like, oh, we're going to farm here. They totally destroy the native prairie or the native forest, and then the farm fails, and in this case, the oil or the mining fails, or they run out, and it just they leave it there. But you show up 50 years, 100 years later, it's still not recovered. It's still not um, what it was or what it should be, and you realize like it never will be. And something at this level where it's one of the last remaining examples of what the Earth should look like. It's crazy to me, just like you're saying that for $30 a barrel, we're ready to destroy that for like forever. Like it'll never recover. Um, so man,
No,
yeah,
it'll have lasting impacts for sure. I mean, you still see there was some there was some seismic work that was done in the Arctic refuge in the 1980s, and you can still see the scars that were there from the original work that was done on the coastal plain, indentations in the tundra. It's pretty remarkable. So that's, work going on probably 30, 40 years since that happened, and you're still seeing lasting impacts of that visually. And that's just a drop in the bucket of what, industrial development on the coastal plain would look like. If you take a look at Prudhoe Bay or any, Point Thompson or any of the other big developments in northern Alaska off the Haul Road, that's taking that and transitioning that to the coastal plain is what it would look like. And we've done some great. I'll share these with you after we're done here. We've done some great modeling, the Wilderness Society, around what development based on the current parameters would look like on the coastal plain. Some great kind of side profile work. We have a great cartographer on staff who's done just some excellent work, kind of visualizing what the development would look like. And yeah, it's startling. There's, I don't know if you've read, E.O. Wilson put out a book, I don't know, 4 years ago now, 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, called Half Earth, and it makes the ecological case for really protecting, preserving, whatever word you want to use, roughly half of the Earth if we're going to actually maintain ecological biodiversity moving forward. And we're starting to see this big 30 by 30 push, similarly, at the global level, around preservation of biodiversity. And if you take that science and that advocacy and you translate it to these place-based campaigns, it's like, okay, so we're taking these, pristine, untouched, high ecological value areas that are hard to get to, hard to extract oil from, and we're essentially degrading them when there's a very open acknowledgement of the fact that we need to be moving in the other direction. We shouldn't even be thinking about places like the Arctic Refuge. The fact that it's in even a debate right now is just to me, it's just the biggest travesty in regards to like folks who are just turning a blind eye to the fact that we need to be proactive if we're going to maintain what we have on this planet that we haven't already lost for future generations, to maintain some kind of balance to where we're able to survive. And the refuge is just a great symbol for that, because it's completely backwards.
man, I'm fired up. I want to go write my letter right now for all of this. So and let's recap real quick then for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. What should, and I'll be sharing this in the Wisconsin BHA group. What should
Yeah.
people in what should we be doing? We'll just keep it Wisconsin related. What should we be doing to help push the Land and Water Conservation Fund forward? And then same thing for the Arctic Refuge.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are pretty simple. I mean, I think it's, picking up the phone, writing that letter like you mentioned, sending that email to the office, and just saying, for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, if you're a BHA member, as a sportsman, man or woman, I feel strongly that we should see full authorization and appropriation, in support of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or just simply, I support the Land and Water Conservation Fund. As a hunter angler, this is something that I care about. It's critical for me, for my future, for my ability to be able to continue to do what I love to do, um, from a hunting and fishing perspective. very similar for the Arctic Refuge, just making your voice heard to, your our two senators, and to whatever member of Congress you have. Luckily, from where you're at in Stevens Point, Representative Kind has been great on the
Yep.
refuge his entire tenure
Yep.
in Congress, and he's also great on the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and actually great on wildlife refuges in general. Um, he's been, stellar. He was head of the Sportsman's Caucus for a while there. Senator Baldwin is equally great on, well, per what you saw at that forum in Wausau on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And she's also been steadfast on the Arctic Refuge for, since she's been in Congress, or in the Senate, well, she was in Congress before that actually too, in the House. So she's been great across the board. Senator Johnson, I probably need to take these comments off the podcast, but Senator Ron Johnson was one of the, don't quote me on this because I can't remember the exact number, but there was like 9 or 10 members of the Senate who voted against a very bipartisan package of public lands bills that included support for the Land and Water Conservation Fund about a year ago or so, and he voted against it, and which is in line with his philosophy or a policy approach regarding federal money is not being used for grants that support expansion of public lands or protection of public lands. So but kind of per my 5-gallon bucket rant earlier, I mean, just making your voice heard, and it doesn't have to be very detailed. A lot of people get mired in kind of the details, like what do I exactly need to say? It's like if you were to call up Representative Kind right now and just say, hey, I really support the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I'm a constituent of yours in Stevens Point, and as a hunter angler, it's something I really care about. I want you to prioritize it moving forward. That is more than enough. The person at the desk takes it down, Land and Water Conservation Fund call, 11:53 a.m. on March 24th, 2020, and so it's, the details don't matter as much as getting, being vocal about what you support and making that known to the people who make decisions in this country.
Yeah, the action is what you're saying, is what
Yeah.
speaks volumes. I love it. So going off of, so now you're back in Wisconsin. Why the I guess also before that, so why the transition to starting to work with backcountry hunters and anglers, and what other, I guess, nonprofits have you worked for before,
Yeah.
or been a member of? Not maybe worked for, but been a member of, and what's important about those groups? Like, what do you look for when you select which groups to be a member of?
Yeah, well, I'll start out with backcountry hunters and anglers. I mentioned I've been a member for a long time. Maybe it lapsed a couple times, but supported them early and often. I mean, to me, there's a few things I love about BHA, and anybody who's listening, membership with BHA is a great way to spend your money, and supporting advocacy organizations through membership is incredibly important for a lot of reasons, and is a great way to also utilize your voice by supporting organizations that are doing advocacy that you agree with. BHA is great. I mean, I just love the a few things. I mean, I love the work that Lan Tawney has done. He's the executive director there, based in Missoula, Montana, about really engaging kind of a younger generation of advocates and sportsmen and women, on issues that affect hunters and anglers. I really love the philosophy that BCHA has regarding supporting policies that promote a more wild experience, a more wild natural hunt, supporting roadless areas and roadless development, wilderness, but also really advocating for issues that are may not directly be in line with the public lands kind of environmental conservation agenda, that are very specific to sportsmen. Access being a great example, making sure that we're able to continue to be able to enjoy our favorite places. So fighting against efforts to transition our public lands or transfer our public lands to private interests. BCHA was really the forefront of that, the leading, one of the leading, or the leading organization in opposition to very real threats around taking our public lands, our national forests, our parks, Bureau of Land Management areas, transferring them to the state or private interests, with the total goal of privatizing them, which is, for somebody who grew up hunting and fishing on public lands in northern Wisconsin, that to me is just a bloody travesty. Great, and it's great. It's something that BHA has just been awesome on. I love their all volunteer kind of model. Very kind of, from a organizational standpoint, very kind of flat across the board. The Wisconsin Backcountry Hunter and Angler chapter, all volunteer organization, dedicated, really smart folks that are really passionate about sportsman issues, but also have an ethic that very much mirrors what we've read by Aldo Leopold and the land ethic. And so, unlike other kind of sportsmen's groups that are more traditional, old school, and as we kind of discussed prior, maybe just entirely focused on the promotion and expansion of the population of a particular game species, BCHA is great in that they see the bigger picture. They care about making sure that we have great habitat for various game species, but they're not going to sacrifice that for the greater ecological balance that ultimately supports these species. The stuff that you don't see, the bugs and the caterpillars and that kind of stuff that is important, but doesn't directly result in more white-tailed deer per se.
No, I definitely want to. Well, yeah, we'll because what was the half Earth idea, and then kind of carrying that over into BHA and maybe the outdoor sports person world with like the idea of healthy forests. But before we get into that, what so now, and you've been a member of BHA for a long time, and now at the state level for Wisconsin, what are kind of more of the responsibilities or the mission you're pushing for now at the state level? Like, what are you working
Yeah.
on with the board?
Yeah, so I'm on the policy committee for BCHA, and the Wisconsin chapter is really focused on a few things. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, being chief amongst them, as it should be. Also looking at issues of access, the railroad bill. For some of your listeners, without going into too much detail, there's been issues in regards to crossing railroad tracks to actual access public lands. BCHA has been working on trying to fix that. Knowles Nelson, which is the state program for the expansion of public lands, or also a program to incentivize keeping public land or keeping large blocks of private lands in a working capacity. So working against selling and transferring to subdivisions, subdividing, etc. Great program. It's been around, bipartisanly championed for a long time. My role with BCHA here in Wisconsin is really, it's still relatively new and kind of finding my feet, but I really have helped the board and TJ, who's the president, kind of being that liaison around federal issues, keeping him and the other leadership apprised of what's going on federally, and how the state chapter can weigh in with our elected officials as being kind of a primary one. As I mentioned kind of earlier, I'm inherently political, so I really have been promoting and doing my best to help the organization build relationships ethically within the C3 boundaries of the organization, to help advance our agenda through building those relationships, and passing and being able to create situations where you are creating the conversation to be able to pass along our positions on BCA's positions on certain state level priorities. And then there's a few other things that we're just starting to get involved with, that I'm interested in related to land management, and specifically right now county land management. A lot of the county forests are going through a process to redo their management plans. There's a huge percentage of county forests in Wisconsin. I mean, literally if not hundreds of thousands of acres, maybe millions of acres of county forests across the state of Wisconsin, going back to when a lot of those lands were owned by big timber companies that ended up defaulting during the Depression, and those lands defaulting on their taxes, and those lands went back to the counties. And so BCHA is just starting to get involved in a lot of those specifics around land management, with some emphasis in particular towards kind of the continued proliferation of off-road vehicles in the state. And that's been a topic that we've discussed at the policy committee level, is seeing this expansion of trails for off-road vehicles, which, for a lot of the BCHA membership, I'm by no means, anti four-wheeler, anti-quad or anything like that. My dad's probably riding one right now as he's going to pick up maple syrup in the woods. But there needs to be space, and there needs to be prioritization for the quieter experience in the woods for folks who seek that more traditional hunting experience in pursuit of game. And, those experiences are becoming less and less. And so I think it's an area that I look forward to engaging, within the organization around, is how do we continue to promote that in a way that's, doesn't necessarily, we're not drawing a line and trying to divide folks, but acknowledging the fact there's a lot of people like my father, myself, my brother, you, many others, the BCHA board, who actually, when hunting or fishing, don't necessarily want to just take their quad to their tree stand, climb up it, hang out for a few hours, get down, take their quad back to the cabin. There's a lot of folks who really, whether trapping or fishing or hunting, the solitude is a big part of the experience and part of the enjoyment, and part of the thrill. So that's something that a huge value of BCHA, and that's part of the reason I love the organization.
I love that. I didn't realize that was an upcoming topic, or I didn't realize that was happening statewide with land management. So no, I'm complete. I agree. I think I've mentioned this. I've talked about this maybe with you and on the podcast, but some of my earliest memories of hunting on public land were up on the Ice Age Trail over in Newwood, and
Yep.
when the Ward paper mill shut down, like you were talking about, all of that land was clear cut and sold off, and now it's all parceled off. Four wheelers are in and out, but it still butts up against other public land, and
Yeah.
I have to take the long way around and get in there. But you get into some of those edges, and you can see where the new land ownership on that private property is abusing those boundaries, and you can see where they just drive in and out of the public land, and it's definitely not, that's not something that's okay. And I think, yeah, if we can get it drawn out at the state level, making sure that that's not happening, because it is a bummer to see, like, I have to hoof it all the way back there, and these people that just happen to have purchased that private land that was public,
Yeah.
driving in and out of it, it's like, I really don't care and it's not even from a hunting standpoint. Like, if that's how you have to hunt, whatever. Like, there's still plenty of deer out there. I still saw plenty of deer during rifle season. To me, though, it's like you're talking about, it's the experience. Like, I hate seeing four-wheeler tracks everywhere. I hate hearing them when I'm trying to hike all the way back somewhere, and someone can just drive up on a four-wheeler. Like, it really bums me out. And then even from, like, I'm looking at it from a wildlife standpoint of what that does to them year-round stress-wise, really bums
Or,
me out.
or when you're like, woke up at the ass crack of dawn and, got 30 feet up into a tree at,
Yeah.
4:45 a.m. and you're, that in a place that you scouted out for like 2 years, and
Yeah.
you're, waiting for that big buck to wander underneath your stand, and all of a sudden, dawn hits and this four-wheeler comes racing below you. It doesn't even know that you're up there. It's happened to me a couple
Yeah,
times.
yeah, that's also happened.
Yeah, that's, then you just kind of like, well, good time for a nap, strap myself in.
Yep. Put the safety belt on, lean into
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, ain't nothing coming here anytime soon.
Yeah, no, it's things like that I think, unfortunately, we have to. To me, it's like you just would assume people would realize, like, hey, maybe I shouldn't drive my four wheeler just like wherever I feel like it. But other people feel the opposite. They're like, no, I can drive it wherever I feel like. So yeah,
Yeah,
creating those boundaries for us because for whatever reason we suck at creating like internal boundaries. But I think that's a good way to trans.
clearly, as you know, as today, I mean, the current situation is a great example of that. I mean, if you needed any more
Yeah,
evidence, then
you're right.
yeah, yeah. I mean, to be clear, too, I mean, there are people that are, um, health,
Yep.
physical limitations, who have a physical disability,
Yep.
that require an additional mode of transportation to experience this. I am 3,000%,
Yep.
100% in support of that. I mean, anything you can to help folks who have those limitations get outside. I'm, not
Yep.
only supportive of, but would happy to help. But there is a line that is drawn there, and I think we're seeing some of those challenges right now, across the state, where we're seeing this kind of unhinged proliferation of, you know, access for off-road vehicles expand, and it's not being balanced by the other side of the equation, the coin, which is those folks who, value, there's a social value, social interest, and the off-road vehicle constituency very organized. They have tons of small organizations, they have larger national organizations, state-based organizations, very organized constituency, and you don't necessarily have that for the quiet pursuit of game constituency. So
Yep.
it's something that I think we need to work on.
Definitely. Definitely. So taking that, let's go into because we're closing in on an hour.
Yep.
The idea of healthy forests. You and I talked about that uh, a week or two ago, whatever that was. We last
Yep.
talked, but and we both love the Porcupine Mountains. So what? So so for me, when I first heard of healthy forests, it's from especially the upland community talking about the need for more aggressive logging because we had these great grouse numbers and now they're on the decline, and they're like it's because we don't log as much, and it's like well maybe we logged too much at one time in history, and that's why we had like this crazy amount of grouse. What are and then the idea of like even Wisconsin DNR, I forget the name of the research, but they're in the process of researching what exactly does healthy forest succession look like, not just hey let's log every 40 to 80 years. So kind of what's your history, what are your thoughts on the healthy forest topic?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I think we talked about prior, I mean, healthy forest is this one of those two words put together that you can pretty much shape to mean anything you want in regards to forest management. And it's one of those terms that just it drives me nuts because it's just so malleable, and it's never really been clearly defined as actually some kind of, it doesn't have like parameters, it's like
Nope.
you can use it to mean whatever you want. It's
It's
like a to whatever end you're trying to achieve, you can use it, to justify kind of.
it's like functional fitness, superfoods, or like organic foods. Like, oh, now
Yeah.
there's a stamp for it. So that's but yeah, anyways.
Collective impact.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh yeah, I mean, so I think there's, if you go back in the history of the state of Wisconsin, you had this late 19th century, this huge cutover of the pineries, up in the not only northern Wisconsin but the upper Midwest in general. And from there, you had the transfer of the logging industry to attempted agriculture, which, for a region that has a very short growing season, not great soils, right? I mean, it didn't work out too well, and you can see remnants of that approach from, all those poor like largely Finnish and, Norwegian farmers and others who tried to make a go of it, after they cleared the land and, got all those huge stumps out of the way. um and then it was like we kind of entered this next phase, which was this kind of proliferation of pulp species. And as pulp prices were high for multiple decades, we were essentially we turned over the Northwoods into kind of this monoculture pulp farm, a huge percentage of it. And we still see that today. You drive up northern Wisconsin, Sawyer County, Rusk County, you go Oneida, you go anywhere and you look and you see just this huge especially in the north central kind of northwestern part of the state. This active management that some would perceive as healthy, maybe healthy from an economic standpoint in regards to output, um, but not necessarily healthy from an ecological standpoint, in that we haven't been prioritizing the restoration of forests in Wisconsin or in the upper Midwest or in other places around the country as well, um, towards an outcome that mirrors within reason, the historic variability that we saw within these forests. So the mix of plant and animal species and trees, tree height, tree diameters, gaps, dense forests, this kind of more menagerie approach of what the forests look like, 150 years or more years ago, before we, went through and really liquidated all the large pine trees from the upper Midwest, as well as other species as well. It wasn't just pines, it was hemlock and the hardwoods where they were. And so, there's this kind of, in the Pacific Northwest, when I worked there was a very active and healthy kind of collaborative approach, and with disagreements around the need to restore forests due to, a large part there due to the lack of fire on the landscape for a long time. How do we get forests back to a healthy point, which is really what they looked like before we started actively managing or suppressing fire? In up northern Wisconsin, you didn't have fire. You had a lot of blowdown that disturbed things historically, some fires. But I'm really been interested in, and Mike Dombeck, who's the former chief of the National Forest, former director of the BLM, and I and others have been discussing, okay, well, what does an approach like this look like in northern Wisconsin, where you're still getting the economic benefit, you're still cutting trees, but your goal isn't necessarily a monoculture soybean farm, that's pulp. It's actually, restoration to an end that mirrors what is within reason, because we have seen changes due to climate, other factors, social, that where you're essentially prioritizing this historic level of variation amongst the trees and forests, and that's something that hasn't really been a focus. There's some good work going on. There's some good protection of some of the native old growth that we still have in the upper Midwest. There's a focus on stitching these landscapes back together, but there hasn't been this all-out movement towards this marriage of economic output for local communities and a move towards acknowledging and trying to restore and bring back other values that have largely been lost. Big trees being one of them.
Yeah, the when we were out at the Porcupine Mountains last summer, we did a 4-day hike in, camp, hike back out. That was my first time there, and I'm like, holy hell, this is like a forest. Like the variety of things we went through, and with my podcast with Jeremy Solon, the amount of biodiversity in like the fungus I found, the plant matter, the bugs. It was, that was like what blew me away the most. Was not in this, this coming from a hunter trapper, was, well, the trapper in me freaked out because there's like crazy fur bearer animal sign everywhere for things you can trap. But we didn't see any deer, we didn't see any like grouse or anything like that in that regard. But it was just the immenseness of the trees in the forest that blew me away the most. And that was kind of a light bulb moment. And then my conversations with Jeremy about actually like, what does forest succession look like from a global historical perspective, not just like you were talking about the cutover and the pulp farming of the Northwest. So yeah, man, it's crazy stuff.
Yeah, it's I mean, there's just it seems like every week or every month you see more and more research around the benefits of old growth forests. There was a study in the Pacific Northwest that looked at temperature in old growth forests, and it was something that I anecdotally felt always. I spent so much time in big old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, and like I always thought to myself, I'd walk into these spaces and it just inherently felt cooler, almost like immediately. And there was a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of work around that from a temperature perspective, and old growth forests being incredibly important as our climate warms in regards to ensuring that there's temperatures where species that will be impacted by a warmer climate will be continued to survive. But there's that's just one example of the benefits, along with the importance of large woody debris being on the ground and how that impacts bugs and critters, and et cetera, et cetera. Not to mention old growth dependent species, martin, or in the Pacific Northwest, spotted owls and marble murrelets. And so it's something I'm interested. I grew up hunting and fishing in northern Wisconsin. Love the Northwoods for many many reasons, and you know starting a conversation around um, a renewed approach is something that I think would be worthwhile while I'm here.
Definitely agreed. Last thing I want to talk to you about before we head out is as a dad, as someone who appreciates outdoor recreation in I think just about all forms. The idea. Are you familiar with the R3 movement? So recruitment,
Yep.
reactivation, okay, and then retention.
Attention. Yep.
So as someone like you do what you do for a living as a dad, what does that look like for you? Have you put any thought into your philosophy on R3?
Brainwashing my child to support my no. I mean, yeah. So I have a 3-year-old daughter, Una, and uh, the I haven't put a ton of thought into it. A lot of what where we've focused on is just literally getting outside as much as we possibly can, and um, you know, f- for her at 3, just being like comfortable being outdoors and comfortable being uncomfortable is really where I've like focused a lot of time and attention at this age. To be frank, it's just there's a certain level of discomfort with being constantly outdoors, whether it's cold or rain or snow or wind or and I think it's one of those things where and I've had this like thought to myself a lot with I meet people who complain about the outdoors because oh it's too cold, it's wet raining, and I'm like, oh, I've become so accustomed to that uncomfortableness that it's not even uncomfortable. And I feel like a big barrier to people getting outside, among the equity issue, which is something we could talk about for days, around the outdoors and equity in the outdoors, which is something that is becoming a movement, which I'm really happy to see. But it's just making being comfortable with being uncomfortable or slightly uncomfortable. And so with our little daughter, we've focused a lot of time on you know being outside when it's not 65 and sunny, and being out for prolonged amounts of time. And I feel like that's what I was raised, and a big part of why I got like outdoor tough. But so that's that's really, I mean, to be completely honest with you, that's where my focus has been, is just like getting her out as much as I can, and when she starts kind of I mean, within reason here. It's not
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
like forcing her, like tying her to a tree
Well,
and just being like, you need to stay here for
have
4 hours.
have
But
so I want to dive into the outdoor equity as well because that's also something I've become more interested in the last I don't know 4 months or so. But
yeah.
going back to our neighborhood, you've seen Margaret running, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
like the baby was like months old and she's out running in the winter. And I'm like, that kid is gonna be so tough. Like,
And now she's running. Evelyn's
yeah,
like, I see
yeah.
her like
Evelyn,
running down. I'm like,
she
Jesus.
she was biking. She was biking down to the church today to get lunch because they were doing community lunches for kids.
Oh,
So
cool.
yeah, that kid's gonna man. I was like, Polly, good luck to you, sir.
Yeah,
Like,
she's at least she's got a circle to run
yeah,
around.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the outdoor equity movement. I mean, it's new. I mean, like you were saying, I mean, it's kind of something that has been, as in traditional environmental conservation organizations have realized some of their past inequities regarding how they not only advocated for policies but how they did it. The acknowledgement of the fact that not all people have access to the outdoors is become a very, and the Land Conservation Fund is a great, speaking another pitch for LWCF. LWCF is great, is it creates equity and promoting green spaces in communities that have a deficit of green spaces is something that LWCF is perfectly set up for and has done in the past. Um, but there's this growing movement of people who are just either through to how they grew up, they didn't have the experiences that you and I had, or they aren't of economic means to be able to get in their car and drive to a national forest, to a national park, or they live in a neighborhood that historically had a deficit of green spaces due to complete, largely ethical injustices that were created when those urban areas were created, a century ago or so. We saw this in Seattle when we mapped. You look at low income neighborhoods in Seattle, you look at high income neighborhoods, and what do you expect? High income neighborhoods, shitloads of parks. Low income neighborhoods, deficits in green spaces. And it's not just due to luck, it was structural and it was intentional from decisions that were made largely that were based on prejudice, 100 years ago when these cities were laid out. And that still is a reigns supreme today. And I'm proud to see that the Wilderness Society and many others, the Trust for Public Land, the Sierra Club, a lot of organizations who are re-looking at equity in the outdoors through a completely different frame, doing some real important relearning around a lot of core elements of our past and history, acknowledging some really hard things that we've done, that were not ethical, and making some changes to how we do our work. It's not like we're sacrificing in any way our ecological values or our work towards ensuring biodiversity, but we're doing it in a different way, and we're also acknowledging the fact that everybody should be able to have these experiences, not just folks who are happy to or lucky to grow up in a neighborhood like mine or ours, or who had parents that took them to the national parks or national forests, who loaded them up in their beat up F-250 and with no air conditioning, rolled the windows down and drove to Buffalo, Wyoming, and as fast as you could. Um, so it's something that there's a lot of folks that are doing a lot of great work on, and it's definitely not at scale that it needs to be, but it's been heartfelt. I've been really happy to see that movement kind of grow. Um,
Agreed, man. Agreed. I'm a big fan of it, and I've been trying to think of ways. It all goes back to R3, but ways I can um, help foster it here, or what it would look like growing something like that in Stevens Point. As someone that's on the events group or events committee for BHA Wisconsin, it's something I want to dive more into when we have our meetings. So,
yeah,
well, dude, we crushed it today. I really appreciate you coming on, and
yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. It's been fun.
yeah, you're welcome. You got any concluders before we log off and you get back to the
My
sugar bush?
concluders. Well, I mean, my concluder is really just praise for what you're doing. I mean, I just love the work that you're doing, both with this podcast, but through various other means, just through your social media work, through your day to day, through the work that you're doing with promoting food. I mean, I just love this intersection of health, of of, of hunting and fishing, of environmentalism and conservation, and kind of all those things together, and exploring that interconnectedness. It's really unique, and I think it's something that we're seeing more and more of, and like that importance of those three things together. And I think it's something that intrinsically a lot of people you kind of know about, but you don't necessarily acknowledge, right? That there's if you're going to promote a healthy lifestyle and have a healthy environment and a healthy society, you can accomplish a lot by having a community of folks that are working together to achieve fitness results and health from a personal level, the impacts that that has on society, but also using that forum to promote a healthy planet and all the benefits of local food. And so really yeah, honored to be both on the podcast, but also begin acknowledging your work from afar here. Really appreciate you personally taking the time to do all this, to um, which really is ultimately for the greater good. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah,
Thanks. That wasn't what I was expecting. Appreciate it.
yeah,
But all right. Well, with that, we're gonna find my cursor, and thanks everybody for watching, for listening, and reach out to your state representatives. All right.